And then while you start the disclaimer, I'll take that big old sign off. Okay, go ahead, Christopher.
Members of the board may participate remotely by telephone or other electronic means due to the local public health emergency, the novel coronavirus pandemic declared on March 16th, 2020, pursuant to the provisions of MnSTAT section 13D.021. All right. We have a very focused agenda tonight. Our sole issue is a presentation on the Graco Park Trail. Carrie Christensen from MPRB is here to present. So Carrie, we'll just dive right in if you're willing.
Sounds good. Thanks, everyone. Nice to see all of you. It's been a while. My colleague Emma Pachuta has been serving as the PAC rep in the last couple of years, so I miss being at the PAC regularly, though. It's always such a good way to connect across projects and agencies, and yeah, it's nice to be here. So Chris, just a quick question for you. Should I present as if I'm also presenting to the back? I know we've discussed that, or should I just do a separate recording for the back? I'm happy to do that too.
Whatever you want to do. Either way is fine with me. Yeah,
right.
Yeah, I'll just leave it up to you.
Yeah, I think I'll keep this a little more organic. It's nice to be conversational. So I'll do like the presentation for that. So thanks, sorry everyone. A little housekeeping. Okay, so again, I'm Carrie Christensen. I'm a senior planner with the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board. And I'm here tonight this afternoon to share out some concepts with you. There's a park planning process underway for Graco Park. So I'm going to share my screen and run through a few slides and then open it up for conversation, feedback, thoughts. Give me one moment here to refresh my screen. All right, so this is a shot of Halls Island, which is right next to Graco Park, and then Graco Park there, sort of in the background. All right, so if anyone raises their hand, I just, if you don't mind, Chris, I can see you, you're spotlighted for me. If you don't mind just letting me know, and I'm happy to, again, have this be conversational, but I will pause and open it up for comments as I go. I'm unable to see everyone's image, so just please note that. So here we go, Graco Park. This park has a long history with the park board. As you may know, this is a Northeast Minneapolis river park. It was, of course, traditional ancestral lands of indigenous people, but also in the for over 100 years was also a lumber yard, the Scher Brothers lumber yard. In 2010, Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board purchased the property. There was some sort of master planning framework efforts that followed with River First, and then Above the Falls master plan, which both encompass this site. And then things sort of stalled out for a while for Graco Park. We did install Halls Island, or reestablish Halls Island, which is that island I mentioned in the foreground. Just to orient you, I'll show a map here in a moment. Actually, I'll go there now. So here's Graco Park. This is Plymouth turning into 8th Ave. So north to northeast Minneapolis. There's Broadway up there. Here's Nicollet Island. Boom Island is just across the bridge from Graco, right across Plymouth, or it's actually 8th, I think, at that moment. So as I was saying, Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board acquired this property over a decade ago, and it's been sitting, as just largely turf grass and a temporary trail passing through the site. And a few years ago, there was a proposed easement in front of, this is actually Graco, the business, the headquarters. There was a proposed easement in front of their business that sort of the agreement fell apart. There was some litigious activity, and finally a settlement was reached. And basically, it was the park board wanted to ensure that we were going to have an easement for the East Bank Trail so that we could connect from Sheridan through this park, which was not yet called Graco Park, to Bloom Island. As part of that settlement, we got the easement, so free of charge, which is wonderful. So that East Bank Trail connectivity can remain and continue to be enhanced. We also received a large foundation donation from Graco, which has propelled the park design process that is currently underway. So it really expedited the build out of Graco Park by probably close to a decade. So we're excited to be here now to kind of be taking these next steps. And there's a few other details like the naming of the park. We agreed in that settlement that it would be named Graco Park. So there's a few others. If you're interested in I can answer any questions about that whole settlement, but that was a really important part of this history and then has now propelled us into this latest year. You can see there's lots of other parks in the area. I think as we talk about designing a park, we always like to keep in mind what's around it, what's the context, what's the level of service for the different park amenities, be it large open green spaces like at Boom Island, Sheridan Memorial Park, where we've got some lovely new public art pieces and a playground, Dickman, where we've got some pickleball courts going in. So another playground here at North Loop. So just a little bit about the context. And so we actually have wrapped up our first round of community engagement. I believe that Emma had reported out when the initial engagement push was happening, but wanted to save our big conversation with this committee for this particular stage in the process, because we've compiled all of our initial community engagement findings, which I hope some of you, shared your thoughts in that initial survey. And we also did, quite a bit of sort of technical analysis of the site. So here's a breakdown of some of those findings. First off, the site is a little bit sort of as this future development site for Graco that was actually part of the settlement, and they purchased this little corner from us. I mentioned that easement is in place, which is what we need to, of course, have public trail or pathway on private land, but that East Bank Trail, the future regional trail connection, is in place. We also did a lot of analysis around, this is a flood area, so got to understand and kind of analyze the 100-year flood area and look into the flood barrier that will be required for different park design concepts. So I'll actually be sharing those flood kind of nuances as we go through the concepts. Other things about this site, it's got great views to downtown Minneapolis. If you've ever hung out here, has this gravel landing, we're calling it. It's not a beach meant for swimming, but more a beach meant for human-powered watercraft or just hanging out, touching the water. There's also actually a grant that's been, I think it's very close to being finalized in terms of funding for establishing mussel habitat, so river mussel, indigenous river mussel habitat along the island and Bank. There's, of course, a large migratory bird population. Halls Island is really primarily focused around habitat, playing this role of habitat as its core function. And other kind of core elements about the site, there's these big electrical lines that really, I think feed to the industrial feeling of the area. It's zoned, a lot of this is zoned production and processing, not much. There's this little corner of single family residential, but for the most part, it's surrounded by industrial or other parkland. Again, I think one of the focuses of our conversation today, I'm hoping, is to talk about Plymouth or 8th and how do we safely get folks across this, knowing that the East Bank Trail currently, as it stands, kind of comes up here and ends and then starts here and continues. So there is this crossing to contend with. And we'll talk more about that later. So just note that. There has been talk of a potential tunnel or underpass going under the bridge. or under Plymouth. It's not actually a bridge at that stage. There was also, we analyzed the potential of a boardwalk here, but there's a lot of constraints with boardwalk and height elevations that are required from an engineering perspective. So that's largely fallen off of the ideascape because of the limited clearance. And one other thing to note is that I already mentioned the green space at Boom, but also that there's a really large parking lot at Boom Island. The project scope does not include any improvements to Boom, but it is, I think, important context as we think about event spaces or other types of uses for Graco. That certainly for some folks, it's been, a concern with thinking about the design. A little bit of context, and then so we, all that sort of more technical analysis. We also did a lot of community engagement when sort of in this project launch period. So out at neighborhood meetings, did some pop-up conversations at Graco. We've had project advisory committee, the other PAC, technical advisory committee, so park board staff, and then agency partners, a number of city staff actually on that technical advisory committee. Lots of online engagement and outreach in the age of COVID, a public virtual open house, a big youth engagement push with a bus tour with over 60 youth that actually drew design concepts for the park that our design team used as like very deep inspiration. A lot of the ideas are showing up in these concepts I'll share with you. And then we did some intercept interviews at Graco. So just a little bit about who we heard from. We always, in a project in the city, in a regional park, which this is considered, we'll set typically engagement goals. And for this project, it's to engage with people that reflect the residents of Minneapolis across race and ethnicity, gender, age, also economic status. There's, the list goes on, but just a little snapshot of some of those demographics. And this is just for the online response. We weren't able to get demographic information for, every single respondent or participant, but, pretty good representative sample. We're inching toward one that is reflecting our city of Minneapolis. And then a little bit about what we heard. And so keep in mind that we developed the concepts really holding a lot of the, the drawings, the deeper conversations, and then constantly referring back to this list of like, what do people really want on the site? What's most important? Heard a ton from people around the importance of the habitat and natural aspects of the site, especially with Halls Island right there. Some interest in different sports and fitness activities, water activities. It was really hot this summer, as you may recall, so lots of interest in trees and shade. So not just from a habitat perspective, but also just making sure it's lovely for people to be on the site. There was also a lot of interest in the idea of vendors or markets, or how do we kind of activate this space as a community gathering plaza potentially. Education, interpretation, it's a really interesting history of the site. How do we kind of embed that into the design? And so on and so on. You can see lots of great ideas and preferences for it. And then one thing I haven't mentioned yet is that we're also planning on building a building, or possibly even two, as part of this project. And so we also took a poll of what folks would like to see in a building. So the idea with this building is it would be part park board and then part tenant that would help with park activation, kind of reworking the idea of how we think about recreation centers. It wouldn't necessarily be a recreation center in its truest form, but more of a community gathering space meets public restrooms, meets storage for operations, meets some other uses that would be tenants that would help us, again, kind of keep the restrooms open longer, but also activate that park and bring more life to the park, bring more eyes to the park. So we had an open call for a couple of months and had some great possibilities come forward, and are kind of continuing down the path. I think in our next stage of engagement, we'll share more details around the building design process, but these are some of the things we heard around what folks would like to see in a park board building on the site. And so here we go. Without further ado, so I'm going to share 3 concepts with you. Then I think we'll just run through the concepts, and then I think I'll come back. We can have a discussion about them, and then we'll move on and talk about the intersection specifically. Does that sound okay? I should also do a time check here. How much, I know this is a very focused agenda. I liked the way you phrased that. So how much time should I plan on here?
What would be a comfortable amount of time for you to present the 3 without any questions?
How about like another 10 minutes of me talking? I'll try and aim for that.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's
Okay.
like we have a generous schedule tonight. Yeah,
Great.
I mean,
Okay,
definitely.
yeah.
Yeah.
I don't want to bore people, so I'll shoot for 10, probably dribble over to a little bit over. But
No worries. No worries.
okay, so concept 1, and this is we're working in almost like a master plan scale. You'll even see some of the items are highlighted in orange, noting that this will be something that would happen in the future. We don't currently have funding for a vendor or like a concessions entity on the site, but that is something that we heard a lot about and interest in, so kind of holding that in these designs. So I'll just work my way down the list, but again, this sort of building showing up, one of the, I think, the strongest design elements of this site is that it's, or this site concept is that all the buildings are stacked right along the street's edge at Sibley, a small parking area for accessible parking and for loading to the adjacent buildings. We've also got, this is probably the most sort of densely activated or programmed concept. So volleyball courts, dog park, of course with stormwater elements throughout. This concept also shows some kind of artful splash pad water feature. And then probably maybe most relevant to this group is that the East Bank Trail connection in all of them would be coming across Plymouth. But here we also have a secondary or potentially primary route, which would be an underpass going under Plymouth. So of course, like the underpass would not be a cheap option. There are safety concerns with an underpass, right? With just making sure that they remain safe and visible. We're calling it an underpass and not a tunnel because we've started to play with and cost out the idea of like a 30-foot wide underpass rather than maybe an 18. So like interesting kind of nuances to what an underpass might look like, but that would feed people to Boom Island where there's a boat launch and sort of a bridge over the marina. So for pedestrians, this would work. For cyclists, it might be a little wonky until we're able to make improvements at Boom Island. Again, there's no improvements to Boom Island in this project at this time. So another thing to note, in all of the drawings, the dashed line represents the flood barrier, which is the 100-year flood barrier. I think that hasn't reached those proportions since like the 1960s. I mean, who knows with our current climate fluctuations, but that's just something that's an interesting feature of each of these concepts. We also, at the park board, I'm sure you're all aware of our trail system. Sometimes we have shared use paths where bikes and peds are together. In this concept, we really trying to split those modes. So this through line of the East Bank Trail for cyclists and maybe peds, pedestrians could walk along more of a plaza with benches, trying to separate out those modes whenever possible, having multiple ways through the park, promenade, and then finally a bridge out to the island with a viewing platform. It was interesting, actually, one of the initial concepts was almost a decade ago in the master plan was to have a boardwalk come out to the island, down and around to Boom, and then under the bridge. And I already mentioned the kind of engineering challenges with getting a boardwalk under the bridge. But and then the budget of getting this like long arcing boardwalk, it's just not feasible. But it was interesting in the last round of engagement, we really heard from folks that they're really interested in just maintaining the island as habitat. So we actually don't show a trail network in any of the concepts. and really just holding on to this idea of that it's really important to have spaces in our system that are primarily geared for habitat. So there'd be a viewing platform, but not a trail. I think I haven't mentioned yet, just open green space. Again, lots of that at Boom, but nice sort of flexible event spaces. And so there you are. That's concept one. There is street parking on Sibley. In all the concepts, you'll also see this future building site for Graco that I mentioned. We've seen a couple very draft renderings. It may not be for another 10 years, but there might potentially be a 6-story tall building there, so office building. So just something to keep in mind as you think about the context of the site. So maybe I'll just pause and see if there's any questions. Otherwise, we can look through all of the concepts and then have more of a feedback type session. But are there any questions? And again, I'm not able to see everyone's screen, so.
One just popped up.
Yeah. I have.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'm just wondering where you would consider yourself to be in this design. Are you at 15, 30%? Where are you in terms of your design process?
Yeah, so good question. Maybe I can roll back up. I actually skipped over the timeline. So we are not even, I'd say, we're probably closer to 15 at this stage, but have lots of different, we've got these 3 options out. So yeah. That's now, which is round 2. And then round 3 will be our preferred concept, and that'll get us closer to 30. And so hopefully in November, we will be sharing out with you the preferred concept. And the idea of the preferred concept is it won't be one of these concepts that I'm showing you, but it'll be some amalgamation of the 3. So what do folks like about 1, 2, and 3, and lumping those together, doing some cost estimating, prioritization if needed of the different site elements with our given budget. And then we'll bring all of that to our board when we'll have a new board in the new year. And so we'll bring that to them in January for approval, which is, if you follow park board process, we've got to bring final design concepts to our board for approval. So we're ways out, and that's that true 30%. The preferred concept will be like 30 with needing some red lines. This will be the true 30, I think, and then it starts moving into construction documents. And then bidding. And we hope to construct starting in fall of 2022.
Carrie, thank you for that. If you want to continue to 2 and 3 explanations, but I would like to say that after you talk about the third potential model, there might be some questions regarding how the climate crisis that we're in factored in, if any degree, to the planning that you and your colleagues have done. I know you've mentioned planning for flooding and native habitat restoration, that kind of thing. So we might follow up on that, but just so you're aware that that's probably will be addressed. So
great. I'll keep that in mind as I chat through concept 2 and 3. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. So concept 2, it looks different in terms of this one's really pulling off of calling it the Minnesota dock concept. So it's like this interesting pier. You can see it's not a bridge out to the island, but really an overlook, giving and also creating an interesting plaza extending out 9th, which is an interesting street because it basically ends a block or so later, I believe in a parking lot. So it's like this little interesting, fragment of city street. But this is, the idea of a market plaza could be a way of activating this area and then bringing the buildings up to the site. And here's a good example, that 100-year flood barrier, really building, of course, placing the buildings like beyond that, but still at the water's edge and elevating them up. So taking in kind of this resilient design approach where we're also getting people close to the water. Lots of grading if you're into topographic lines here, with some edges of native planting, and then some open flexible green space again. Small parking lot again for the loading and accessible spots. And in a different configuration, and then a winding East Bank Trail up to Plymouth. No underpass in this one. And some interesting kind of straight shot down to the water, pedestrian circulation paths. That's that gravel landing. And I think that's, that's for the most part, again, stormwater treatment throughout as another definitely kind of a standard, both required and I think climate resilient management technique or design principle. This one also shows a kayak rental and storage building, which the other concepts don't focus on. But we are, we know that this is a popular spot already to boat. And so how do we create access for folks to get their watercraft down, potentially to do storage, maybe moving away if folks are familiar with Lake of the Isles, moving away from like an open boat storage area and doing something more like a locker system or even a building system, and potentially a rental space also. That's actually one of the tenants that we're talking to is a boat, kayak, and canoe education and rental and livery service. So I think that sums up concept 2. I don't know if there's any questions for this.
I had one.
Please.
Which is, so this concept versus concept 1, and I'm sure we'll see some changes too in concept 3. Like this does not have the underpass, as you mentioned, under Plymouth Avenue, and it does have a parking area. And I'm wondering if you have considered, like, how do you expect people to arrive to the park in the different designs and what implications that might have for how it would be used?
Yeah, I love that question. Yeah, great question. So maybe we could even do that for all 3 concepts, but certainly, and when we look at the intersection treatments, I mean, if there's big events, one thought is that folks would park at Boom Island parking lot, across on foot, the intersection, come down the trail, to the open green. Sibley parking, there is again street parking. So and then this would be accessible by trucks, maintenance vehicles, farmers market trucks. So there are sort of those considerations for loading zone. But this trail, right, the East Bank Trail is really one of the, I think, most significant features of Graco Park, and just as a through space for cyclists and pedestrians, people rolling and walking. So that, I think thinking about this intersection, even though also the street grid, like how people might be coming off of Plymouth, crossing Sibley and coming down, not everyone's going to be coming from Boom. This bridge, we did play with the idea of there's a set of stairs over here. Could there be a secondary way to come off of Plymouth right into the heart of the park, instead of coming down to more of an entry plaza? So that fell away because of the complications, I think, with some of the engineering and just costs and how many folks might actually just be entering the park off of this side of Plymouth, right? Like it's really difficult to skirt across Plymouth here. It's really just happening at the intersection or maybe just a little bit up. So hopefully that answers your question, like in terms of entry, I think.
Yeah. I was just thinking about how if it were a more, the more inviting entrance, or maybe the safer feeling entrance of being able to enter under the street, maybe would just kind of change the composition of who is even interested in getting to the park. Yep.
I mean, it's a challenge with the tunnels or underpasses, and the safety or the perception of safety even. That's something that's been brought up a lot. And so how do we design a tunnel or underpass that feels inviting and that people are really coming out in an interesting area with this little bridge and kind of got to turn some interesting way. You're not coming out into the city street network. So that is one of the reasons that we have a concept like this with no underpass. This is in some ways a much, it works with the current configuration of the East Bank Trail, doesn't require updates that we don't currently have funding for. So there's, I think this is a I don't know the right word, but I think this one is feasible in that, you know, if there's a lot of engineering that's required for things here, and then potentially again those perceptions of safety, there's issues. But so I like any thoughts though. I that's something I'd love to hear from all of you about though, is sort of underpass / tunnel versus intersection, and it's something we've gone round and round. So that's why there are multiple concepts, right? Any initial just responses to like underpass versus you're saying that you think that the underpass would feel safer?
I suspect we'll get more feedback after we see the third concept. But first, I know Austin, you had your hand up. If you want to dive in now, and then we'll continue with the third concept.
I was actually going to comment on the underpass versus street crossing concept, so maybe I'll hold my question until we're ready to talk about that.
Awesome.
Terrific, Carrie, if you would.
Thanks. All right, cool. So concept 3, here we go. We're again kind of bringing the buildings closer to the street, but still in the park. And I mean, the idea with the buildings is that we're activating the park. This again has a strong access, but breaking the grid out to the river, but not a bridge. Seating along the shore. This is the most, I think, habitat-centric or the wildest feeling concept. Lots of vegetation with up top, thinking about kind of a big woods scenario with native plantings, prairie, and then floodplain forest planting, with mimicking Minnesota plant communities. The trail pulling through the site, but also having a secondary way to get through, again, with the underpass. So just picture, you know, different sort of habitat zones, the buildings, you know, breaking the grid, and the small areas of plaza and promenade, you know, two very distinct ways to get through the site on foot or rolling. And again, those same intersection treatments, same future building site for Graco. You see the flood barrier here, playing with different elevations. Oh, and then public art. So this one's got the idea of, you know, this is in Northeast Minneapolis. So how do we bring public art into the space to kind of celebrate the nearby arts district? So 10 represents the potential of some kind of sculpture walk or some other public art installation space. One of the other tenants that we're talking to in the building is a local arts organization, and just thinking about activating the park through an arts lens is really exciting. Food for thought. So any quick questions on this one? Otherwise, I'll open it up to all 3.
Austin, why don't you start us off talking about the underpass, if you would, please, or the tunnel, or whatever we call it.
Sure, yeah, and thanks for this presentation. Very informative. Lots of thought was put into this, and thanks for coming to our group. This is relatively close to my home base in Minneapolis. I bicycle over here pretty often. I live near the university. I think a lot of students also still live in this neighborhood too. The reason why I say that is because the bicycle infrastructure on Plymouth and 8th Ave Northeast is it's pretty robust in my opinion. I mean, there are dedicated bicycle lanes through the Plymouth 8th Avenue corridor for quite a while. And so for that reason, it has me thinking it makes more sense to have at-grade crossing for the trail, because then you can easily get on Plymouth or 8th and navigate the on-street bicycle paths. Usually I would be a fan of something that's not at-grade because it feels more streamlined, perhaps could reduce commute time, things like that. But the at-grade crossing at the intersection of Plymouth and Silby makes me think that then you could connect. You don't have to go out of your way to connect to the already existing infrastructure. To me, it seems more cohesive to do it that way. And that's my opinion.
Great. I mean, what you just named, I think, is why intersection treatments show up in every single concept. Really knowing that connecting to the street grid here is really important part of this project scope that actually wasn't on the initial project scope, and it's been the city, of course, like has been a really important thinking partner on that. This is a city-owned street, but yeah, I'll keep taking questions, and we can move on to intersection. I'll talk more about treatment there.
I also have a question or a comment around that. I don't know how you want me to raise my hand.
I think you just did, Julia.
Okay. I walk over there a fair amount, and sometimes go underneath, sometimes go at grade, and neither is great. But I think my question is, with what we see with the most recent IPCC and how quickly we need to really be reducing emissions to zero, and how in Minneapolis that's going to rely on transportation shifting more rapidly than we were maybe looking at it doing in the Transportation Action Plan, it seems like the conversation around safety of an at-grade crossing is sort of predicated on conditions now, not conditions within the next 10 years. Is that something that you're starting to talk about, or how is where we need to be within 10 years in impacting this conversation?
Oh, I love that point. I'm taking notes. I mean, I think that's such a great question to raise, and thank you for that. The concepts for the intersection treatments that we are looking at are indeed drawn from the street design guide and MnDOT bike manual. So for state aid roads, so we'll look at those, and you'll see that I think it is more geared toward current conditions when we think about that street crossing. Just to answer your question, but I just love bringing that question into the room, and I think it should be brought into the room with every.
So within the internal conversations, is that happening? Like, are you saying we're restricted in this way by MnDOT's like refusal to take climate breakdown seriously? But if we weren't, here's sort of what would be. I mean, are you building the argument for the safe at-grade crossing based on what our reality is, even though that may not be part of what is politically feasible yet? Or is it just sort of because it's not seen as politically feasible, it's not even within the projections?
Well, I would say that it's a spectrum. I feel like we haven't dove in deep to design for the intersection yet. So I will bring your question into the room when we do. So I'm going to say that first, and I love it. Thank you for that. But I also, there is, for example, it's a state aid road, and with that, I don't know all the nuances of state aid roads, but I do know that things like a raised crossing currently would not work on a state aid road. And so that is something that I know there's been some conversations around trying to push to see if this might be a pilot project for thinking about raised crossings in a state aid road situation. So there have been some internal, like, well, is our raised crossings of interest? Is this something worth pursuing? And that's actually a question for all of you. When we look at the intersection treatments, we could go look at those really quickly. Just to have a little more context, I think I might just pause because it feels like it's coming up a lot. If that's all right with everyone, I'll just jump to these and we'll come back to the concepts with this in mind. So again, here we are, Sibley, Plymouth to 8th, or rather Plymouth to 8th. It is a city-owned street. It is a state aid road, so high volume level of traffic. There is this bridge coming across the river with with somewhat of a slope. People are coming pretty rapidly. As you mentioned, there's some nice existing bike lanes, some protections with those bike lanes. This idea that like providing access from the East Bank Trail to Boom Island and Graco Park is for us the most significant feature of this intersection. While the city has other goals, but for us, it's really focused on this idea of calming traffic to get all users across safely. This is the driveway to Boom Island, and this is the continuation of the existing East Bank Trail, which is actually master planned to swoop down by the river in the future when Boom Island is updated. And so these are the very high level kind of initial assessment. Safety island is something. It might be all of the above: curb extensions, safety island, raised crossing. Since I know you're a savvy group, I assume you're aware of kind of examples in our community of each of these. These are out of the City of Minneapolis Street Design Guide, which, as you, I'm sure, know, followed the Transportation Action Plan. And then we also have MnDOT Bike Facility Design Manual, which includes things like a median, refuge island, unsignaled intersection, protected intersection, curb extensions. So there's, lots of different potential for slowing traffic. There's, but again, it is a state aid road, it is a city-owned street, and we will be working in collaboration with the city and state aid road standards on developing a design. Those conversations really have just begun. But the city is, really excited about the potential of the East Bank Trail connecting up to the city network, making sure this is, we're at least improving the crossing in collaboration. So hopefully that gives you enough context to keep digging in to your great points around underpass versus intersection or both. Any other questions or thoughts?
Not regarding the intersection, but I have a question regarding the flood barrier and your planning on that. Could you expound on that a little bit? What do you mean by a barrier, and how is it computed? And I know you computed on a 100-year anticipated flood, but it seems to me that these 100-year floods are becoming much more frequent. And can you just talk about the design process and what informed that decision, and actually what the flood barrier would look like in these different concepts?
Yes, so we're working with Bar Engineering, and I'm not, I'm not a hydrologist or, but they have helped us model the site over time, and also did historical look at flooding, and again, like dating back to the 60s is the last time we saw a 100-year flood in this particular part of the river. But the flood barrier itself is identified again through modeling, through a software that looks at elevation points, and so that's what the idea of a barrier is. Probably a misnomer though. It's really about raising the site to a certain elevation to keep the areas on this side of the dash line from flooding in a 100-year event. So that means that everything in here would be designed and built with the understanding that it would flood potentially, right? And that's just something that I think when we talk about resilient design, that is actually a reality, and just designing for flooding is one way of thinking about flood mitigation or just resilient planning. The flood barrier itself won't actually be like a firm wall. I think maybe when the plaza meets a certain grade, it might look like a retaining wall, but for the most part, it'll just be regrading of the site, which if you can see the son of topographic lines in each of these concepts that show that elevation gaining through mostly through earth moving. So it won't, we could definitely do just like a flood wall, right? But we want to also create a park in a space that's okay to flood. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. Barb, I see your hand. Barb, do you have a question?
Sorry, muted. I didn't hear you addressing lighting at all. Will there be lighting in any of the three concepts? Especially the one that I was concerned about is where there's lots of woods. If people are coming in the evening and various times of the season, it gets darker. It could be feel a little bit less safe walking if there isn't any pedestrian lighting. So I'm just questioning that.
That's great. I'll take that as a comment, and I know certainly we will have lighting, and the extent of the lighting is not determined yet at this stage, but there will be lighting. One of the things, with trails by the river, and especially being adjacent to Halls Island, thinking about the habitat ramifications of lighting in a wild space. So we'll be balancing, it's going to be a balancing act, certainly, with how much lighting on the site and what type of lighting. So that is a good question, and I will bring that kind of that safety piece into the conversation as we talk through lighting. So thanks.
Okay.
Chris, I see your hand, and I think I saw Aaron's pop up and off. So Chris, why don't you go, and then we'll go with Aaron.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for coming, Carrie. I also used to live over here, and so spent a lot of time at Boom Island and Graco, watched it kind of develop from sort of nothing almost, so it's cool to see these. I was just wondering, you were talking about connecting with the city, like what group you've connected with, or like who you're working with at the, just from.
Yeah, so
my-
Matthew Deardahl is on the TAC, sorry.
Okay,
And then
cool.
there's a number of folks from CPED that also serve on the TAC.
Okay.
And then we've had some conversations with the bridge folks around a potential underpass.
Awesome.
So I can get you actual names, but there's.
No, I was just wondering if there was someone from planning, just saying, but yeah, Matthew's got that. And then also I'll just throw out my personal preference. Obviously Matthew can dig into more detail from like the city's official review, but I think some sort of median, and I don't know if there's been talk about like a rectangular rapid flash beacon, at least for like the trail connecting side. I think at this location in particular, with the amount of people and just the type of traffic, with traffic coming from both sides at once, that can be a really effective design. So I'll just
Great.
throw
Thank
that out.
you. I'm looking for suggestions. That's wonderful. I forgot to mention also we've met with Ethan. So Ethan and Matthew were our initial workshop on intersection
Cool.
potential.
Good people to have.
Do you have
Yeah.
stormwater?
Aaron,
Do you have stormwater and
Aaron-
sewer people?
We do,
on there?
yeah. Yep, we sure do.
Okay.
Yeah, Jeremy Strelo and Stephanie are both on the project.
Aaron?
Yeah, I was just gonna say about that intersection. Obviously, I know you're changing the intersection. That initial look at it is frightening to me. We talk about design vehicles a lot here. So here's my design vehicle is like a bicycle or a stroller with like a child seat on the back, and then another child trying to bicycle across the street with me. So, you know, as it's being designed, I think that's why I guess I lean so much towards the underpass, because it just isn't risky from a like, will I get run over standpoint. And I really appreciate the designs that you're bringing forward, and you know, I trust everybody that you're talking with on the TAC, so you know, I'm sure you'll come up with something good. But that just to explain, I guess, why I was you know, pretty heavily favoring that non-grade crossing option.
Great, thanks.
And I'll just jump in here, and then we're going to go to Austin. I just want to echo.
I've got one too.
Okay, and we'll go to Austin and then Julia. And I'll just be real quick. I just want to, I concur with Aaron, and partly because I think that, you know, you have a flow in a park along the river, and then there's this barrier, and then you have to shift to go into the traffic and undergo what Aaron was talking about if you have family or younger members with you, and then come back down to the river. I think that is a barrier that I would encourage to be removed. And I think the way that you've talked about that is to do a wide underpass. And so the flow of pedestrians and, you know, cyclists can just be along the river. I mean, because that seems like a primary design guideline, and a focus of the settlement with Graco is to get that easement, that connection, so you can do these kind of things. So with that being said, Aaron and then Julia. Oh, I'm sorry, Austin and then Julia.
Thanks.
Yeah, I agree. I think in normal circumstances, I'm definitely pro underpass. I just am thinking of climate change and what happens when the river permanently rises, because I think that is something that we're looking at. And the reason why I say this, it's so funny. I was just in Chicago visiting family, and near Lake Michigan along Lakeshore Drive, there's tons of underpasses that let pedestrians access Lake Michigan, and several are permanently flooded because Lake Michigan is rising. Now I realize it's apples and oranges. Mississippi River is different than Lake Michigan, but no, I don't think very many people thought about that when they were building those underpasses. You know, and I think it's a really hard thing to broach because no one can really predict the future here, and we can try to be climate resilient, and it sounds like you all put a lot of work into that. For me, as just a regular civilian, though, that's always in the back of my head is like, what's this going to look like, you know, post-climate when the river is permanently higher? So that's the reason why I bring that up.
Interesting. There's actually, you know, for this kind of scenario, we have certainly been thinking about the floodability of the tunnel or the underpass. And even like, could there be design features where we barricade and create temporary flood wall if needed? Or, you know, there are ramifications with flooding, even in our current scenario, and the tunnel that need to be thought through as part of the design process, for sure. So good point, and thank you.
Julia.
I actually have a couple of questions or comments. So Christopher, let me know if you want to go to somebody else. But I would echo the concerns about flooding that Austin raised. That's something that seems like an increasing risk. And along with that, what Christopher said about the 100-year floodplain, and I'm wondering if you or this contractor ran numbers for like a 1,000-year flood. I know that that's something that we're seeing in other parts of the world, and I don't see any reason to think that that's outside of what we can expect, since this is a spiraling and intensifying issue rather than linear. And let me just look at my notes. That one I would really love to know sort of where you and your team are at in terms of adjusting really for those large scale events and being erring on the side of caution. And I'm also curious the context of what drains here, what would drain over land if the sewers or stormwater sewers weren't able to handle the volume that if we saw sort of those long duration storms staying in place like we've seen this year in a couple of places around the US, what places, how much of Northeast is draining through here, and how the permeability of the roadways might differ now from what it was in the 1960s. I don't know if that was sort of a single event or just maybe it was a winter event that slowly accumulated. So that overall question. And then I also am curious, you mentioned the history of the space for Native people, and I'm wondering what level of conversation has gone on there, how it's been compensated for people, and what kind of racial justice is being built into this plan. So that's my 1,000 questions.
Great, thanks. So I'll start with, I think the one the one question around flooding that I do have a clear answer for. So I know that they did modeling for several different iterations of flooding, and I believe that beyond the 100-year flood, level was modeled. I can certainly follow up with you by email or send information. Maybe, I don't know, Chris or Melissa, what you guys think, what's the best way to follow up on that? But I can definitely get you more information around what was found and what was modeled. The 100-year flood was modeled for this particular design concept because as part of this settlement, Graco wanted us to agree to this idea of a 100-year flood barrier in the site. And I neglected to mention that earlier in the settlement kind of montage. It's not as usually it's like central to the conversation. So I love though that you all are thinking about climate and flooding so astutely. So this stipulation really came out of the Graco settlement, and that they wanted to model and build a barrier for the 100-year flood event. And so we're integrating it into the entire site because they're doing it here. So it's like now becomes a design move. I don't know that this park, that we'd be raising the elevation to the 100-year flood barrier without that kind of push from Graco for their site. So it's interesting. I mean, flooding is not in itself a bad thing, especially when we think about parkland. Like, we can be a more resilient landscape for floodability. And so that's like very, very high level kind of philosophical take. And then that's why the 100-year was focused on for the designs. Did I answer all your flood questions? And then I'll move on to
the other one is sort of tied into that, and I really appreciate you bringing up flooding as part of it, like the need to allow things to flood to reduce
the draining,
force.
like the pipe shed, yes. Basically. Yeah, okay, thank you. So that I do not have information on right now. That'll be, how about that be part of my follow-up? I'll see what kind of research we do have on that. I know that there's been district analysis, so potential for bringing in pipe shed from other parts of the neighborhood to do more of a district treatment. in the park, and that there was not enough, runoff onto this site or in the pipe shed leading to this site to warrant a district stormwater approach. So that leads me to believe that like the actual kind of pipe shed district stormwater piece, it's like not that significant in terms of what this parkland is receiving or passing through this park. But again, I can follow up and kind of verify or see if I can dig into more information and share that question with our with the engineering team.
Carrie, if I can just
I'll really be
interject,
looking forward to it.
we've been going for about an hour, and by that I mean means you have been going for about an hour. I appreciate your willingness to for an extended conversation. What I would propose is that you, if you would, you could address Julie's question regarding Indigenous input into the design or anticipated Indigenous input and issues.
Yep.
And then if anybody else has a question, let's raise their hand or comments. And if that all goes, we'll probably wrap up in 5 minutes or so.
Perfect. Thanks. Great plan. Okay, so one of the things we've been working to do with engaging with both Native community, local community, and also tribal leadership in projects is trying to work across projects more effectively at the park board. And so we are doing regular communications and updates to the TIPOs. And so Graco got, the last couple of updates has been included in those more leadership level updates to all of our regional TIPOs. And then we also have done some pointed outreach to Indigenous partners. Part of the youth tour that I mentioned, we had youth from Migizi do a canoe trip to the site and talk through the design. Also, as part of that larger youth tour, there was Indigenous groups represented. So along with other groups from St. Paul and regional, mostly BIPOC youth. So really interesting kind of design ideas coming out of those conversations. But I think one of the core elements with the building and the site design that we're finding is this idea of interpretation is a really important theme, whether it's the industrial or whether it's the Indigenous. And so as we start to drill down into what those are, working more closely with Native community is the plan. I'm not going to tell anyone's story, right, without working with them. And so that that's emerging very much so. I'm like, what are the next steps? But that's what we've done to date.
Awesome. And in terms of compensating, is there anything going on or returning control? Just curious if there's anything with either of those aspects.
So we have, again, across projects, had some larger land back conversations. And for this site was not identified as a specific site of significance there in terms of the cultural historical. There are other sites in the park system that are emerging as significant, so that are more likely in those conversations and more targeted. So again, across projects, this one has not been elevated to that level of how do we talk about land back? Also, just a side note, the comprehensive plan for the park board includes some strategies around kind of land and Indigenous, not just acknowledgement, but creating a culture of kind of restitution. And there, hopefully you'll see some language emerging from the park board in the near future around our work ahead of us on that front.
Thank you.
I neglected to say just a couple of things that I very much like. I very much like in number 3, I think that's the only one that depicted seating on the water's edge or the existing water's edge. I think that is terrific. I think the city needs more benches and places to rest your feet, or at least I do when I'm out for a walk and to take in the scene. And that I think is a great addition or a great proposal. And what I don't like is, for whatever it's worth, is concept 2. I just get the feeling that it's PV Plaza light. There's so much building and trucks, and it's too much. I think my inclination is for 3, native grasses, native trees, flood zone trees, the island not accessed. That I think for me personally is has an appeal. So does anyone else have any follow-up comments, closing comments, or questions that we can briefly address?
I have one last one, just a comment.
All right.
Okay.
Go ahead.
When you were mentioning the sort of implicit activation of the space through tenants, I was really excited and thought it might mean that there would be housing associated with this, and was disappointed when it turned out it wasn't. So it sounds like a great step if there's a way of incorporating housing, really making it higher density, and that would help address some of what Barb was raising, which is something that also limits how I use this area. So that's my comment.
Thank you. Hey, y'all, thank you so much. That was fun. Nice to dig deep in and nice to have time. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, and we appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Thank you,
Thank
Carrie.
you, Carrie.
All right.
All right.
Be well. Stay safe.
Thank you.
You don't need a resolution from us, or are you wanting something from us for this time? No.
Not for this time. No,
Okay.
thank you though. Unless you want to take a stance, you're welcome to, and I look forward to seeing it.
Okay.
So I would love this recording though. I think Chris, just to circle, I think I can find this on the page, right?
Yeah, I can also pull it and send a link to you.
Okay, if you think of it, otherwise I'm sure I will find it. Thank you all. Take care.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Carrie.
Thank you.
You too.
All right, bye.
All right, Chris or Millicent, do we have any wrap-up announcements or anything, or are we going to say good night to everyone, or good afternoon at least?
Nothing from me.
Terrific. Well, it was nice seeing everyone, and thank you for coming. And it's nice to have the luxury of an hour on one thing. I think I have a much better understanding. So thank you, and I wish everyone a good evening.
Thanks, Chris.
Take care, all.
Good night.
Thanks,
Good night, everybody.
Have a good one.